Congratulations to Republic TV for putting together the Nationalist Collective. And I'm going to speak here today about a topic which is on top of your minds, which is, of course, the major churn, geopolitical churn that the world is going through. We are witnessing one of those moments in history when the world order basically resets. These are turbulent times. Now, of course, I have to be a little careful about what I say here because I am a policymaker and I'm dealing with a live situation. So I requested my friend Arnab to allow me to wear my hat as a historian because, you see, we are a very ancient civilization. And in this very long history, we have not only witnessed but participated in many periods of geopolitical shifts. And so there are many interesting lessons that we can bring to bear over these many thousands of years of history. And I'm going to use two episodes to illustrate this issue. So the first issue, or rather first episode that I'm going to deal with, relates to something that happened exactly 1,000 years ago. In the year 1025, when, as some of you may be aware, the great king Rajendra Chola did a raid on Southeast Asia. So this was a major naval raid, a major geopolitical event of that time. And I will first get you to understand what were the circumstances in which it happened, and two, what are the lessons we can draw from it. And then I will go on to the other episode. So let me take you back 1,000 years ago. What was going on? What did the world look like 1,000 years ago? So 1,000 years ago, the world economy basically was about trade between three major nodes. One of them was in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Fatimid Empire out of Egypt. The second was India, which was the southern India was at that time dominated by the Chola Empire. And the third was China, ruled over by the Song Empire. And these three nodes were trading each other heavily, particularly through the maritime route. Now, it is important to note here that we are all very proud about India being, at that time, something like a third of the world economy. But you have to understand that this wasn't only about the domestic economy. It happened because we Indians dominated world trade. And how did we do it? It wasn't about, individual heroic merchants sailing out into the horizon. It was actually done by large guilds, merchant and artisan guilds, which were not dissimilar to multinational companies. We even know their names. For example, one of them was called Mani Gramam. Another was called the 500. Why 500? I presume because they had 500 shareholders. So it was like a modern corporation. And these were not small bodies. They had sort of operations across the world. For example, the 500 had major operations in Southeast Asia. They had their own navy because there were obviously pirates everywhere. Indeed, some of these big multinational merchant guilds were so powerful that they survived through many dynasties. So dynasties would come and go, empires would come and go, but these massive merchant guilds would continue. And these merchant guilds were financed by a very sophisticated financial system, interestingly run out of the temples. So in case you have ever wondered why is it that Hindu temples in the medieval period had so much gold, it was not because the kings of that time were handing over their gold to the temples. So let me assure you that Indian politicians of all eras are always very reluctant to hand over their money to anyone. So even at that time it was true. The reason Indian temples, Hindu temples had so much money was because they functioned as banks and venture capitalists who were financing these merchant and artisan guilds to build out this massive merchant, what I would call an export-led model of growth. So this was what allowed this domination of this global economic system. Now, a series of events in the early 11th century threatened this. So what happened is, you have to know that a lot of this trade was happening between India through Southeast Asia to China, Korea, Japan, and so on. And this happened through two routes. There was one route which went through the Malacca Straits, which is between Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, which was usually controlled by the Srivijaya kings of Sumatra. And the other route was through the Sunda Strait, which is between Sumatra and Java, which was usually controlled by the Javans. So these were the two routes through which the Cholas were trading with the Song and other kingdoms of that part of the world. Now what happened is that the Sumatrans were under tremendous pressure from the Javans, and at that one point, a series of battles, the kings of Java basically defeated the Srivijayas. So the Srivijaya went running to the Chinese for help. And the Chinese decided to provide them with a great deal of support. So the reason I'm telling you this is that Chinese geopolitical projection is not a new thing. It was happening 1,000 years ago. And it is with the help of Chinese support that the Srivijaya managed to not only defeat the Javans, but take control of the Sunda Strait as well. So now you had a situation where the same power controlled both the Malacca Straits and the Sunda Straits. And of course, they did what all monopolists do. They dramatically jacked up the tariffs for passing through those straits. Now, this is something that was against the economic interests of the Cholas. So what they did is they sent a warning in 1017, a small raid, to warn the Sumatrans that, look, we are not happy about the situation. But the Srivijaya ignored it. In fact, worse, they projected to the Song Emperor that the Cholas were their vassals. I'm sure this information managed to wake it back to Rajendra Chola. So exactly 1,000 years ago, in 1025, Rajendra Chola decided to make a naval raid. Now, there is no evidence that Rajendra Chola had a large standing navy. So it is almost certain that most of the navy that he used were actually the navy of these merchant guilds I talked about earlier, of the Manigramam and of the 500. And so a large naval force was put together. It set sail from Nagapatnam, which is still a major port today. And from Nagapatnam, they made their way across the Bay of Bengal to Sumatra, and then along the western coast to the Sunda Strait, where they probably refueled with their Javan allies. And having got refueled, they made their way up the Malacca Strait, sacking all the ports of the Srivijaya, and finally landing in Kadaram, what is modern Kedah in Malaysia. They destroyed the army of the Srivijaya completely. And then they made their way back past Nicobar, back to base. This was a major event, as you can imagine, and as a result of which the trade routes opened. And a few years later, we have a record of a joint embassy by the Cholas with the Srivijaya, where presumably they basically came to some agreement with the Song Emperor. It is worth noting here also that the Chinese actually did absolutely nothing to help their Srivijayan vassals. Now, what is the lesson about this whole episode? What can we learn from this major event in our history? First of all, very important to remember that there is actually no difference between economic power and military power. Hard power matters. You can have all the soft power you want, but hard economic power and hard military power are needed, and they are joined in the hip. They're actually the same thing. You cannot have one without the other. It's meaningless to have one without the other. So this is something that our ancestors knew. We are all proud of ancient India, and for some reason we have been somehow given to believe that India was some sort of a uniquely pacifist country. That is not the case. While we may not have gone and colonized other countries through actual occupation, we did culturally colonize other places, but not through actual occupation. We were not above protecting our economic interests by the sword when necessary. The second important thing is even with your geopolitical rivals, you can enter into an understanding when you have economic interests which you may share. For example, it is very likely that the Song emperors were just as unhappy about the tariffs that they were being imposed by the Srivijaya. Or at the very least, they understood the Indian interests and allowed us to do what we want to do, even to their own vassal. So whenever we are thinking of the Chinese, do remember that, yes, they have their interests, so do we. And if it suits them, and indeed, if we push hard enough, it suits us, we will be able to pursue our interests. But we have to be very clear what those interests are and to be willing to back it with both economic and military hard power. So this is the first episode that I wanted to tell you about. Now, this economic system that I described, unfortunately, fell apart in the early 13th century. All these three nodes of economic hub that I talked about were essentially sacked by raiders from the Central Asia. China's Song Empire was destroyed by the Mongols. India itself was sacked by the Turks. And of course, the Middle East was an absolute upheaval because of also the Mongols, who sacked Baghdad and other places. The temples, which were the backbone of our financial system, were sacked. So people tend to only think of this in cultural and religious terms, but do remember that it was an absolute economic disaster as well, because the financial basis of our Indian economic power was also destroyed. Notice that many of our big temples are all along the coastline. Where is Somnath? It is on the coast. Where is Konarak? It's on the coast. These were all temples which were related to the port activities of those areas. So we went into decline. Now, a couple of more centuries passed, and what happened is that in many of these places, new powers came back. These Central Asian hordes were either pushed back or at least put in control. So, for example, the Mongols were finally defeated by the Ming, and the Ming emperor rose and became a major power in China. In the Middle East, the Mongols were overthrown by the Safavids. So in Iran, and so the Middle East also came back. In India, although northern India continued to be under the control of the Central Asian invaders, at least much of southern India came to be under the control of another great empire called the Vijayanagar. Now, in this situation, it's quite interesting what the Chinese did. Remember, the Chinese, just like today, they were very conscious that they had come back from a period of decline. So what they did is, they wanted to also project power. Just like today they want to project power, the Ming emperors also wanted to project power. So they built a huge navy. This navy was led by a very unlikely leader, an admiral, who was a eunuch actually, called Admiral Zheng He. And Admiral Zheng He led these magnificent expeditions into the Indian Ocean. The ships he used were massive. They were massive even by modern standards. And in each one of these expeditions, he had between 20 to 25,000 sailors and soldiers and merchants on these expeditions. So these were huge expeditions by modern standards. The technology they were using at that time was almost a century ahead of what the Europeans were using. So the ships were huge, the technology was huge, and there was no doubt at that time that the Chinese were far in advance of anybody of that time. And using these ships, Admiral Zheng He came to the Indian Ocean. And he sailed all over the Indian Ocean. He came to, he went to Indonesia, where of course the main rival to the Chinese were the Hindu empire of the Majapahit, which was a Hindu empire of what is now Indonesia. He came to Sri Lanka, he came to India, he went to Africa and to Arabia. Now it is important, while he was trading, it is important to remember that this was primarily a projection of power, because do remember that these are not voyages of exploration. Indians, or indeed even the Chinese, had been sailing these waters for hundreds of years before that. So what they were really doing was signaling that, look, yes, we were conquered by the Mongols, but China is back. That is what they were signaling. And they made repeated voyages. Indeed, they did a lot of geopolitical maneuvering also in the Indian Ocean. So, for example, they tried to change the king of Sri Lanka and put their own candidate there. Since they were suspicious of the Hindu Majapahit Empire in Indonesia, they actually backed an Islamic kingdom in Malacca. So they encouraged the local king of Malacca to convert to Islam, and then they backed it to fight against the Majapahit. So you can see the Chinese have been in this area doing their thing for a very long time. And this is what Admiral Zheng He as well did. And he made repeated voyages. So if around about the 1435 or so, you had asked anybody, you know, some part of the world is going to dominate the world, can you guess who that's going to be? They were almost always, everybody was going to say China, not Europe. They were all going to say China. They were ahead technologically. They were already geopolitically powerful. They had taken over large parts of the world's oceans. So, everybody would have said, next few centuries belongs to China. But then something very interesting happened. You see, the Ming emperor died, and a new Ming emperor came to the throne. And this new emperor had been brought to the throne because of the support of the Confucian mandarins, which is the bureaucrats. And the Confucian mandarins were suspicious of their rivals in court, who were the eunuchs, like Admiral Zheng He. So they did what all good bureaucrats do. They switched off the money. They must have made the procurement process very, very complicated, as you can imagine. Simple way to shut down the military. And in fact, the Chinese Navy was never defeated in war. All that happened was that it rotted. It literally rotted in the port. And the records of these great voyages of Zheng He were completely suppressed. In fact, they did such a good job of it that it's only in the 20th century, late 20th century, that we have now begun to discover the importance of these great voyages of Zheng He. So, there was no sudden collapse of Chinese power. It slowly faded away. Chinese support, of course, continued to various vassals in the Indian Ocean. For example, Malacca fought against the Majapahit, pushed them back and back, till the last of the Majapahit withdrew to Bali, where they continued to remain Hindu. But rest of Indonesia basically over time became Islamic. As I said, the Islamization of Southeast Asia was a Chinese geopolitical project. Not many people know this. In other parts of the Indian Ocean, the withdrawal of the Chinese led to a vacuum. And into this vacuum, a new power turned up, the Portuguese. So this is the environment in which Vasco da Gama turned up with just 3 ships. Now, in case you wondered, how is it that this small power, Portugal, which was not even a major power in Europe, turns up in the Indian Ocean and basically takes it over within a decade or two? The reason it was able to do this is because the Chinese had been there before them. They had knocked out all their rivals and then just walked off, leaving a vacuum which the Europeans just happened to fill up. So this leads us to some of the great lessons of history. What are those lessons? First of all, be very wary of bureaucrats. As you can see, that you can have all the geopolitical ambitions in the world, but it's your internal politics that will do you in. And this is what happened to the Chinese. I'm not just including the bureaucrats, I meant that facetiously, of course, but your internal dynamics matters a lot more than you think, even if you happen to be a great power. So today's great powers, whatever that's happening to them, is driven largely by their own. They don't have to be necessarily defeated in war. It is their own dynamics which will lead to their downfall. Second, it has a very important lesson to India. Remember that between the decline of the Chinese and the coming of the Portuguese, there were several decades empty. Now, why is it that the Vijayanagar Empire, the Indians, did not fill it out? This was, after all, an empty space. The Vijayanagar Empire was a very prosperous empire with a long coastline, and indeed very much aware of coastal benefits of coastal trade, because its own wealth was based on maritime trade. And yet the Vijayanagar emperors made no real attempt to create a big navy or project power. Look at the change in attitude between Rajendra Chola and Vijayanagar Empire. Now, the Vijayanagar was a great empire indeed, but it did not lead to a re-establishment of Indian economic, military or civilization power. It was at best a holding job. They were holding on, but it didn't help. Retreating behind the walls never helps. That's what the Chinese discovered. Having the Great Wall of China hadn't helped them against the Mongols, and it didn't help them later on against the Manchurians. And for us to have decided that we were not going to project power in the maritime space and remain at home did not mean that we were left alone. Far from it, the Europeans turned up, and the next colonization of India actually happened from the sea. So this has, again, a very important lesson to us today, that we have to engage with the world. Just because we want to hide behind the walls does not mean that the rest of the world is going to leave us alone. So to be a great power, to revive as a civilization, we cannot think of it in terms of purely being domestically oriented. We have to engage with the world. It has to be done by an outward orientation, because no matter what you say, the rest of the world is going to carry on. You may not have an interest in them, but they have an interest in you. So these are the two big episodes of Indian history that I gave you. There are many others that I could talk about, but the point I was trying to get to, now coming back to the present, is this. We now face a peculiar period in world history where clearly the old order is breaking down and a new order is appearing. We are an emerging power. We want to be a great power, but we are not there yet. And we are in an environment where there is not only rivalry between the two large existing powers, but they also look on us with some degree of suspicion. So this is an environment which we have to deal with, but we need to deal with it with the following principles in mind. First of all, we cannot compartmentalize different fields of power. We have to not just have an all-of-government approach, we have to have an all-of-nation approach. We cannot separate out military power from economic power. We cannot separate out the government and public sector from private sector. All of these things are intertwined. Whatever our internal differences may be, when we are dealing with the world, we have to be on the same side. Because the people with whom we are dealing with are going to come to the table being united on their side in their own way. Secondly, world power and dynamics of world power are extremely unpredictable. Do not bother to try and predict it. After all, nobody could have guessed circa 1450 that it was not the Chinese but the Portuguese who would come to dominate the Indian Ocean. Not possible to have predicted it. Similarly, it is not possible for us to predict exactly how things will pan out from here on, either with President Trump or with President Xi or with many other people around us, not to mention random shocks like COVID that could happen. What we need to do is to be internally resilient and have policies that are flexible to deal with the situation as it appears. We tend to get very disappointed every time things do not quite pan out the way we may have planned. But in fact, it should be entirely surprising if it does pan out the way you planned it, because the world is uncertain. It's an unstable place by definition. So the game is not to have grand plans, but to invest into your own strength and, very importantly, be willing to act opportunistically when the opportunity arises. So you have to be willing to go in there and do it. And finally, when we say Atmanirbhar Bharat, or we say Swadeshi, we should not confuse it with some 1950s view of import substitution and looking inward. Of course, we should build on our own strength, but it has to be an outward-oriented approach. We need to go out there and capture export markets. We need to go out there and build geopolitical linkages. And we need to be willing to use these for pursuing national interest. So maybe a few questions from the audience.
Ready, mic 3.
You'll have to wait for the mic.
Mic 3.
I'm into a bit of a teaching also and others. One thing is there, we're saying we're going towards protectionism, though globalization is the key. The one thing you again gave a pitch for globalization. So how far, what kind of a trade-off is there between globalization and protectionism, which a lot of politicians on TV are made in India and whatnot? A bit of light you can throw upon it.
So we need to be proud of made in India, but we should not confuse it with going back to license permit Raj and building ambassador cars. So when we say make in India, we need to be clear that this means that we have to engage with the cutting edge of what is happening today. That doesn't mean accepting shoddy products just because they're made in India. So this is why it is very important that we should be willing to be at the cutting edge. In many cases, that may involve having various kinds of alliances in different spaces with other countries as well. It may need us to have a much more proactive effort towards R&D. It we may need to have a far more realistic approach about creative destruction of our own corporate sector, such that the efficient survive, but the inefficient are weeded out. So all of this is important, because when we say make in India, it means building on our own strengths. It does not mean sort of keeping some inefficient type of thing going. As I said, this is not a return to the ambassador car. You cannot compete with the rest of the world if your ambassador car is your cutting edge. Somewhere else, maybe the lady there can be given the mic. Or maybe, yeah.
Sir.
Where are you? Who's speaking? Yeah, there, okay.
सर, ये जो अभी चल रहा है ट्रम्प के साथ, तो क्या ट्रम्प जो कर रहे हैं अभी वो भारत के लिए बेहतर है या मतलब नेगेटिविटी में जा रहा है ये भारत के लिए?
तो मैं अंग्रेजी में उसका उत्तर दूंगा,
जो आपकी इच्छा हो।
हाँ, क्योंकि अभी तक अंग्रेजी में ही बोला है मैंने।
कोई
तो so the fact of the matter is, we should not waste our time thinking about whether President Trump is a good person or a bad person. He is what he is. We should accept it as the state of the world and pursue our interest to the extent we need to do, in whatever way we need to do it. I think too much of the media debate, or even debates in the drawing rooms, are about whether or not he is a good person, trustworthy person, and so on. That is irrelevant. He is currently the President of the United States. He will do what he is doing. We should accept it as the state of the world and engage with it flexibly, pursue our interests. Where we need to stand our ground, we need to stand our ground. Where we need to make trade-offs, if it is possible, we shall make trade-offs. We should not be emotional about the whole matter. This is about long-term pursuit of Indian interest, which will last over not just President Trump, but the next 5 of his successors. So we have to think 25, 30 years of sustained engagement with the world during a period when we will go through our own demographic benefit period. So our job is to really deal with the world it is. So the point, the push I'm making is for a realist approach to our economic and foreign and military strategy, not an idealist approach.
Sir.
Where are you?
Sir, here. Here, sir.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. So if after this, the mic can be brought to this side as well. Yeah.
Yeah, sir, continuing with the tariff situation which has been raised by the earlier questioner, what can the government actually do additionally to support our exporters so that they can still go out and capture the markets out there?
So, as I said, first of all, I have to be careful what I say because I said I'm a policy maker, I'm not an analyst, and we are in an active, live situation. But let me say that whatever needs to be done will be done. We have announced before where deregulation needs to be done, it will be done. If financial support is needed in some fashion, that will be provided. But at every stage, we will also look to other partners. Remember that the US is not the only game in town. There are other partners we also need to look into. And even in the case of the US, there are things we can pursue. So I don't think we should, get into this game of, looking at this to be played in a defensive way. This has to be played in offense. And if it requires us to do major reforms, then we should do it. Or provide whatever support we do it. All of which will need, as I said, an all-of-nation approach. Just cannot be done by government. There has to be a wider effort by the population, by the corporate sector in pushing this effort. Yeah.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Shorojit Sanyal. I've come all the way from Goa, and I came yesterday evening, and this is the second edition. And by profession, I have been a chef for last 4 decades. And the first World Food India in 2017, which was inaugurated by Modi ji. So I made food from 27 different states, But I specialize in Mediterranean, Pan-Asian, and classical French, That's my bread and butter, But now I'm doing modern Indian. I've done a lot of research on it. And now, of course, I have opened one of the food courts here in Gurgaon, and second will come up very soon near the Lokmanya Road, very soon, 31st of August. So there I have stressed a lot of, Dadima's food, like the Konkan belt, where I live in Goa. So it's a 2,000-kilometer stretch. And I was here last time also, and I have sent a mail to the Republic media also that what I have in mind, Because, so many, younger generations with all this junk food and all. So, like if you say something like a pizza, so we can have a substitute for it, something to do with, wheat. We can do a rotsa or a nanza. So a lot of things, if somebody wants to come to our food court and see, like a lot of things which are not known to India, and the younger generation do not know about it. And I have also sent them a mail, a proposal, what I intend to do.
No, it's fair enough. I mean, if what you're saying is that we should promote our indigenous foods, I agree. If you can pass the mic over to the lady there. There is no question that we need to do that as well. And by the way, in addition to this, we need to also remember that we need to be willing to protect our indigenous seeds, cereals, crops of various kinds. And this is indeed one of the major issues which we have had while negotiating with the rest of the world. We have made an extra effort to try and protect our indigenous food systems. Because it is very easy to then slip into an environment where we are entirely dependent on hybrid varieties which may not be as nutritious as our domestic varieties. And losing food diversity is not only a bad thing, but very often what happens is that a few years later, this same indigenous variety turns up patented in some other country and then sold back to us. So we need to be careful of this, and so yes, I agree with you.
I'm Dr. Madhumita Kothari, and I'm an international lawyer and an international maritime lawyer. Therefore, what you spoke about India as a maritime power is an area of interest for me, and therefore I want to ask you this question since you are advising the Prime Minister also. Now, when I was doing my PhD on blue economy and ocean governance, I had put in a lot of issues in terms of India's maritime issues. We have a coastline of 8,118 kilometers. There are more than 19 ministries of the government of India which have stakes in the oceans. But there is not even one body to coordinate between these 19 ministries of the government of India. And except for the security issues along the coast and some port works being done, are we really capitalizing on our maritime resources? This is my question to you.
So this is an issue on which I have spoken widely, as you know. Although I will warn you that creating yet another Ministry of Coordination of Maritime Issues is a bad idea. You'll just end up creating another layer. As somebody who works in the government, let me say that the best we should do is to try and get those ministries to coordinate with each other, then create another layer. So I wouldn't advocate creating another coordinating ministry. But what you said otherwise is an important issue. So let me explain it to the rest of the audience. You see, we have land borders and also a coastline. When we look at our land borders, one of them is, of course, with our friendly neighbor to our west, with whom we don't trade at all, as you know. And while we do trade with China, which is the other land border, we don't trade with the bit that we have a border with, because we are actually, even that we are doing most of the trade with their East China, which is also basically maritime trade. So if you look at it from an economic and geostrategic perspective, India is actually an island nation. We are as much an island nation as Japan or Britain. 95% of the goods that go in and out of India, our exports and imports, happen through our sea lanes. So therefore, protecting our sea lanes is absolutely critical. And yet, you'll be shocked to know that over 90% of our trade is carried on foreign ships. I would argue that this is our single biggest geopolitical risk. Forget other countries sanctioning us. If a handful of large global shipping lines sanction us, we would be in serious trouble. We could not sustain, beyond a few weeks without imports of spare parts, of energy, of all kinds of things coming in from the rest of the world. So maintaining control of our shipping lines, having the capability of moving goods on our ships is very critical. And yet, we currently have only 480 odd ships, Indian-owned, a matter I raised a couple of years ago. And so, in the last year and a half, you may have seen that a lot of effort is being put into reviving our shipping, and I'm saying here specifically the merchant ship. So Navy also has seen a lot of investment, but I'm talking here specifically about our merchant Navy. A lot of effort has gone into it. We are beginning to revive shipbuilding in India in a very large way. We intend to become, within the decade, in the top 5 shipbuilding countries in the world, and I think we have a good shot at that. A lot of resources are being put. A very large maritime fund has been created. The shipbuilding yards are being opened. Large billions of dollars of large ship orders are being placed. And so a lot of effort is going to that. Recently, 4 big maritime-related laws were changed relating to ownership and flagging and so on. So this is a sector which we are going through very, very big changes. And we intend to invest in ships and shipbuilding and things maritime in a very big way in the next few years. With that, let me bring this to a close, because I think this has been a long session and there are other speakers as well waiting. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Jai Hind.